Russia and Asia. Southward expansion. The Russian drive to the east in the 18th century brought the Tsar's empire to the Pacific Ocean and the frontiers of China by century's end. In the 19th century, Russian expansionism focused on the south. There, the backwardness of the Russian military did not matter since the people they faced were even less industrialized and technologically advanced. In 1860, Russia established a military outpost on the Pacific coast that would eventually grow into the great naval port of Vladivostok. Today, Russia is the most southerly city. In Central Asia, the steppe lands of the Kazakh nomads came under Russian control early in the century, setting the stage for a confrontation with three Uzbek states farther south. They succumbed one by one, beginning in 1865, giving rise to the new province of Turkestan, with its capital at Tashkent in present-day Uzbekistan. In the region of the Caucasus Mountains, the third area of southward expansion, Russia first took over Christian Georgia, 1786, Muslim Azerbaijan, 1801, and Christian Armenia, 1813, before gobbling up the many small principalities in the heart of the mountains. Between 1829 and 1864, Dagestan, Chechnya, Abkhazia, and other regions became parts of the Russian Empire. The drive to the south intensified political friction with Russia's new neighbors, Qing China and Japan in the east, Iran on the Central Asian and Caucasus frontiers, and the Ottoman Empire at the eastern end of the Black Sea. In the latter two instances, Muslim refugees from the territories newly absorbed by Russia spread anti-Russian feelings, though some of them brought with them modern skills and ideas gained from the exposure to Russian administration and education. The Russian drive to the south added a new element to the Eastern question. Russia confronts British India. Many British statesmen and strategists reckoned that a warlike Russia would press on until it had conquered all the lands separating it from British India, a prospect that made them shudder, given India's enormous contribution to Britain's prosperity. The competition that ensued over which power who would control southern Central Asia resulted in a standoff in Afghanistan, which became a buffer zone under the control of neither. In Iran, the standoff between the powers helped persevere the weak Qajar dynasty of Shahs. Preserve the weak Qajar dynasty of Shahs. Cultural trends. Tsar Alexander I. Unlike Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, which began to send students to Europe for training only in the 19th century, Russia had been in cultural contact with Western Europe since the time of Peter the Great, who ruled 1689 through 1725. Members of the Russian court knew Western languages, and the Tsars employed officials and advisors from Western countries. Peter had also enlisted the well-educated Ukrainian clerics who headed the Russian Orthodox Church to help spread a Western spirit of education. As a result, Alexander I's reforms met a more positive reception than those of Muhammad Ali and Mahmud II. However, his reforms promised more on paper than they brought about in practice. It took many years to develop a sufficient pool of trained bureaucrats to make the reforms effective. Decembrist Revolt. Abortive attempt by army officers to take control of the Russian government upon the death of Tsar Alexander I in 1825. Ironically, much of the opposition of Alexander's reforms came from the well-established families that were not at all unfriendly to Western ideas. Their fear was that the new government bureaucrats, who often came from humbler social origins, would act as agents of imperial tyranny. This fear was realized during the conservative reign of Nicholas I in the same way that the Tanzimat-inspired bureaucracy of the Ottoman Empire served the despotic purposes of Sultan Abdul Hamid II after 1877. Individuals favoring more liberal reforms, including military officers who had served in Western Europe, intellectuals who read Western political tracts, and members of Masonic lodges who exchanged views with Freemasons in the West, formed secret societies of opposition. Some placed their highest priority on freeing the serfs. Others advocated a constitution and a republican form of government. When Alexander I died in December of 1825, confusion over who was to succeed him encouraged a group of reform-minded army officers to try to take over the government and provoke an uprising. This so-called Decembrist revolt failed, and many of the participants were severely punished. These events ensured that the new Tsar Nicholas I would pay little heed to calls for reform over the next 30 years. Tsar Alexander II. The great powers meeting in Paris to settle the Crimean War in 1856 forced Russia to return land to the Ottomans in both Europe and Asia. The humiliation spurred Nicholas's son and successor Alexander II, ruling 1855 through 1881. To institute major new reforms to reinvigorate the country. The greatest of his reforms was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. He also authorized new joint-style companies, projected a railroad network to tie the country together, and modernized the legal and administrative arms of government. Intellectual awakening. Earlier intellectual and cultural trends flourished under Alexander II. More and more people became involved in intellectual, artistic, and professional life. Most prominent intellectuals received some amount of instruction at Moscow University or some German university. Universities also appeared in provincial cities like Kharkov in Ukraine and Kazan on the Volga River. Student clubs along the Masonic lodges became places for discussing new ideas. As Russian scholars and scientists began to achieve recognition for their contributions European thought, scholarly careers attracted young men from clerical families, who in turn helped stimulate reforms in religious education. Just as the Tanzimat reforms of the Ottoman Empire preceded the emergence of the young Ottomans as a new and assertive political and intellectual force in the second half of the 19th century, so the initially ineffective reforms of Alexander I set in motion cultural currents that would make Russia a dynamic center of intellectual, artistic, and political life under his nephew Alexander I. Thus, Russia belonged to two different spheres of development. It entered the 19th century a recognized force in Europe politics, but in other ways it resembled the Ottoman Empire. Rulers in both empires instituted reforms, overcame opposition, and increased the power of their governments. These activities stimulated intellectual and political trends that would ultimately work against the absolute fear of Tsar and Sultan. Yet Russia would eventually develop much closer relations with Western Europe and become an arena for every sort of European intellectual, artistic, and political tendency, while the Ottoman Empire would ultimately succumb to European imperialism. Section Review. Russian society resembled Ottoman society, but Alexander I undertook top-down westernizing reforms. Nicholas I's suspicion of Western ideas stalled reform and slowed industrial development. Slavophiles opposed Westernizers and, after the Crimean War, embraced Pan-Slavism, contributing to Russophobia in the West. Russian expansion southward and eastward added vast territories to the empire and caused friction in China, Japan, Iran, and the Ottoman Empire. Resistance to Alexander I's bureaucratic reforms sparked the Decembrist Revolt, which stiffened Nicholas I's hostility to Western ideas. The humiliation of the Crimean War drove Alexander II's reforms, including emancipation of the serfs. The Qing Empire. In 1800, the Qing Empire faced many problems, but no reform movement of the kind initiated by Sultan Selim III emerged in China. The reasons are not difficult to understand. The Qing emperors that skillfully countered Russian strategic and diplomatic moves in the 1600s. Instead of having a Napoleon threatening them with invasion, they enjoyed the admiration of Jesuit priests who likened them to enlightened philosopher kings. In 1793, however, a British attempt to establish diplomatic and trade relations, the Macartney Mission, turned European opinion against China. See Chapter 20. Canton System. China's most serious crises were domestic, not foreign. Rebellions by displaced indigenous peoples and the poor, and protests against the injustice of the local magistrates. The Qing dealt with these problems in the usual way, by suppressing rebels and dismissing incompetent or untrustworthy officials. They paid little attention to the far-off Europeans and brushed aside the complaints from European merchants who chafed against the restrictions of the Canton system by which the Qing limited and controlled foreign trade. Economic and social disorder. Population pressure. Early Qing successes and territorial expansion sowed the seeds of the domestic and political chaos of the later period. The early emperors encouraged the recovery of farmland, the opening of previous uncultivated areas, and the restoration and expansion of the road and canal systems. These measures expanded an agricultural base and supported a doubling of the population between about 1650 and 1800. Enormous numbers of farmers, merchants, and day laborers migrated in search of less crowded conditions, and the permanent floating populations of the unemployed and homeless emerged. By 1800, population strain had caused serious environmental damage in some parts of central and western China. While farmers tried to cope with agricultural deterioration, other groups vented grievances against the government. Minority peoples in central and southwestern China complained about being driven off their lands during the boom of the 1700s. Mongols resented the appropriation of their grazing lands and the displacement of their traditional elites. In some regions, vigilante organizations took over policing and governing functions from Qing officials who had lost control. Growing numbers of people mistrusted the government, suspecting that all officials were corrupt. The increasing presence of foreign merchants and missionaries in Canton and in the Portuguese colony of Macau aggravated discontent in neighboring districts.